Of 18C, we're going to be looking at circulatory pathways, so just some blood vessels of the body, looking again more at some structural abnormalities or interesting things. For example, we'll look at venous pathways, which we've talked about having more anastomoses or interconnections, and veins tend to have more than one name, and so that makes venous pathways harder to follow. A lot more arterial pathways are given kind of strict names that stick to a specific title. We are also going to just acknowledge the brain and digestive systems and how they have unique venous drainage systems. So make sure to look at, in your lecture textbook, the dural venous sinuses and the hepatic portal system. The brain contains the dural venous sinuses, and the hepatic portal system is important for the digestive system because we want to make sure that what we reabsorbed or absorbed through the small intestine is able to be looked at before it gets to general circulation, because what we could have absorbed was a pathogen, and we just want to be able to treat that blood. So let's go ahead and look at some principal vessels of the systemic circuit. Some of these are going to be just diagrams. We'll be kind of getting a general feel of some of the names you might see and kind of thinking back to chapter 1 and how these diagrams are oftentimes going to have terminology that reminds us of body regions. A lot of this part of the chapter has schematic flowcharts. Oftentimes these are called pipe diagrams, and they just show blood vessels that are closer to the surface in brighter colors, others are in deeper colors, and that means they're kind of further away from the surface, or they're deep compared to superficial. And there's just some general tips for memorizing blood vessels. First and foremost, again, go back to chapter 1. Look at, for example, regional terms of the body, things like axillary, brachial, femoral, or renal, hepatic, gonadal. Not only will that help you in memorizing blood vessels, but it'll help you just kind of get a refresher there on that terminology that you'll see throughout the chapters of anatomy and physiology too. Some general facts here: arteries and veins tend to run side by side, and in many places they also run with nerves. So you would see that an artery and a nerve, for example, might be wrapped in a similar kind of connective tissue membrane to hold it in place. But a lot of systemic blood vessels don't always match on the right and left side of the body, because a great example there would be almost all vessels in the head and the limbs are bilaterally symmetrical, but some large, deep vessels of the trunk are asymmetrical or even unpaired. Excuse me. So here I just want to look at the aortic arch, and then I'll point out some other stuff in a minute. But coming off the aortic arch, the first 3 branches from the left to the right are the brachiocephalic artery, the left common carotid artery, and the left subclavian artery. So it's common to know at least the first 3 branches off the aortic arch. The aortic arch does branch around and go down into the thoracic aorta, and then it'll go down and become the abdominal aorta. And the thoracic and abdominal aorta have their own branches. You can see here a separation between the thoracic and abdominal cavity, so the diaphragm here is indicated or used to indicate that. So that was a pipe diagram. So here is figure 18.23b showing you the major arteries of systemic circulation, more kind of realistically in a human body. You can see they're relatively similar. So we have pretty much bilateral organization of the major arteries, but just be aware that where they should be is not always exactly where they are, so there is some deviation among individuals. Here's just another pipe diagram showing arteries of the head, neck, and brain. Here the brain is removed, but we have an interesting structure that we're going to see in just a moment again with the brain in place, and this is the cerebral arterial circle. It's sometimes called the circle of Willis, and it's just a broad arterial anastomoses. So that's an arterial junction or interconnected junctions of arteries, and it's found at the base of the brain. So it's inferior, it's found at the bottom. Here's just more figures, but we find that cerebral circle at the bottom of the brain here. We can see here part of the aortic arch. Let's move over. Here's that image I was talking about. So major arteries serving the brain. They all seem to kind of interconnect at this arterial anastomoses that we're calling the circle of Willis or the cerebral arterial circle. So I just want to highlight that. This is an arterial interconnected space called an arterial anastomosis. Remember, an anastomosis is just an interconnected amalgamation of vessels. And you can see the different parts of the circle. Here's the bigger picture. So we have different communicating arteries, cerebral arteries, all of them coming together to interconnect at the base of the brain around the optic chiasm and around the pituitary gland. Here's another pipe diagram just showing you those three branches off of the aortic arch. We're also looking at the right upper limb, and let's just look at some of the terminology. So in the upper arm region, so above the elbow, we have a brachial artery. There's also arteries like radial and ulnar, which are going to match up with bones like radius and the ulna. So make sure that you're looking at terminology and how it possibly matches stuff in that region. So some of it matches up with bones like radius and ulna. Some of it matches up with body regions you learn in chapter 1 of your lecture textbook like brachial. Some of it really is going to match up not only with stuff from regional terms, but things like body cavities like thoracic and abdominal. So keep that terminology in mind and use it to your advantage. Here is just the anatomical organization of the right upper limb and thorax. Here's another pipe diagram, and immediately you should know, after identifying here's the diaphragm, that we're looking at arteries of the abdomen, even without this title up here. So we're looking over here just at arteries of the abdomen. We have some terminology like gastroepiploic. And so you might not know all that yet, but as you learn terminology, you start to kind of put together where that is. So epiploic tends to be, or has to do with like fat pouches in the digestive system. And then gastro is stomach. So this is somewhere near the stomach, probably attached to a mesentery, which contains fat pouches. Splenic artery, you should know that goes to your spleen. So start picking up on the prefixes that refer to different organs, such as mesenteric has to do with mesenteries, or at least something in the abdominal cavity. Or renal has to do with kidneys, gastro is stomach, things like that. So here's just a look at the arteries of the abdomen with the organs in place. So let's just look at that splenic artery again. It's actually going to branch off of part of the aorta and then go to the spleen. Here is that abdominal aorta. We can see some major branches. There's also some structural differences here. For example, the renal artery going to the left kidney is a little shorter than the renal artery going to the right, and that's because the inferior vena cava would be right here. So inferior vena cava would be a venous structure that drains blood from kind of the lower half of the body or inferior under the diaphragm, and it would just kind of be in the way, and that moves the abdominal aorta over here and allows for some slight structural modifications to the length of arteries. Here we can see just how involved the vascularization of the digestive system organs and certain tissues are. So you can see the branches of the superior mesenteric artery. It involves things like intestinal arteries, ileocholic arteries, regular cholic arteries, mesenteric arteries. That one's a little easier to remember because these are branches off of it. And it's just serving all parts of the colon and even small parts of the mesenteries that encompass them therein. Here's another pipe diagram showing similar information, but now we're looking at another limb, the pelvis and the lower limb. So let's look at this image. We can see that there's some deeper arteries, such as this very large, right here, sternocleiac artery, which will lead us to the femoral artery. And then we have the posterior tibial artery, which is behind the anterior tibial artery. And the tibial arteries are near the tibia. So again, start using terminology to help things make a little more sense. Popliteal artery near the popliteal region. Fibular artery near the fibula. Plantar arch related arteries on the bottom of the foot. So again, terminology is very helpful, and use what you already know when it comes to learning blood vessels. All right, now we're going to be looking at major veins of the systemic circulation. We'll just point out some kind of main ones. So we have the superior vena cava above the right atrium of the heart, inferior vena cava below. We have a little less symmetry in the abdominal cavity when it comes to veins. The same could even be said for some of the stuff in the thoracic and head regions. But we have a lot more interconnectedness in the veins. But if we still take kind of the base overview of the major veins of systemic circulation, there's still some bilateral symmetry. And we have similar terms like we saw with arteries: axillary, cephalic, brachial. All those veins are going to use terminology you've seen before. So axillary near your armpit, that's seeping fine. Hepatic veins are going to your liver. So hepat is a prefix that means liver. Some of the branches off of the superior vena cava are the brachiocephalic veins, which then go into or branch into the subclavian vein and the internal jugular vein. So this is just looking at some of the venous drainage of the head, neck, and brain. And remember, the brain has these specialized dural sinuses. And these dural sinuses are just kind of enlarged, thin outpocketings that are able to collect not only cerebrospinal fluid, but also blood draining from the brain that needs to go back to the heart via the superior vena cava. So here are actually the dural sinuses. And kind of like the coronary sinus, they're thin. They're not exactly like regular veins. They're able to collect cerebrospinal fluid on top of deoxygenated blood. They would just return that back via the superior vena cava. All right, we can see the upper limb, just a closer view. So we're going to slip back past that. Here we're seeing a schematic or a flow chart of veins of the abdomen. So I just want to point out a hepatic portal vein, which is connecting the capillaries of the liver to the capillaries of the intestines. That's the hepatic portal system. And it would kind of be right in this area. It's been removed, but here's our inferior vena cava. The abdominal aorta would be right here. The hepatic portal system would be right over here. So here's that hepatic portal vein, not in that flow chart, and kind of a more realistic interpretation. And then it would go to the capillaries of the liver, and that would be a connection between the capillaries of the intestines and a portal system. If you think back to chapter 15 in your lecture textbook, then you remember that a portal system is two capillary beds linked by portal veins. That's what we have here. There'd be capillaries in the liver, capillaries in the intestines, and they're linked by this portal vein. And the purpose of this portal system is just to take the blood that has a lot of nutrients in it and send it to the liver to be looked at, because there's macrophages and sinusoidal capillaries in the liver. And that means that if there's any toxins, the macrophages can get out of the capillaries, examine this nutrient-rich blood, and make sure that those toxins are destroyed. They were just making sure that we haven't absorbed anything other than nutrients, really, that could be dangerous to the body if it was let into systemic circulation or the regular circulation. So it's kind of like a pit stop for the nutrient-rich blood from the digestive system before it gets to enter the rest of the blood flow. Here are just some diagrams of veins of the right lower limb. So let's look at some terminology. We had a popliteal artery where we have a popliteal vein. We had an anterior tibial artery where we have an anterior tibial vein. So a lot of things are going to match up, and we have a lot of vein pathways that match up with artery pathways. Here's just the foot. So we do have plantar veins as well. Digital veins would be the toes. And that is it. So do review the flow charts. Let me go back so it's not a black screen. But do review the flow charts. Look at the pipe diagrams. Become familiar again with some of the terminology, like things like popliteal, anterior versus posterior, fibia, tibia, fibular. Body regions are definitely something I would go back and look at in chapter 1. You will not be extensively tested in your exam over blood vessels, but you can expect to see extensive testing in, for example, if you're taking lab, in your pre-labs, and check your recalls and check your understanding, and you can expect it in some of your activities. But you're not going to be extensively tested on your exam. When you might be tested on your exam, you have activities that kind of give you a base understanding of the vessels you'll be responsible for. And of course, if you have any questions, just ask. So make sure to go back and watch all the other parts of chapter 18 if you have not. And that's it for chapter 18. So stay tuned for chapter 19 in the upcoming weeks.